Sanctions are often presented as a peaceful alternative to war. They are described as precise tools, carefully designed to punish governments without harming ordinary people. In the case of Venezuela, this narrative sounds especially convincing. The story usually begins with corruption, authoritarianism, and mismanagement. Sanctions are framed as a response, not a cause, as if the collapse simply happened on its own, and outside pressure merely followed events already set in motion. But this version of events leaves out what actually mattered. Venezuela does not collapse in isolation. It collapses inside a global system where oil, money, and power are tightly connected. And sanctions do not simply restrict behavior. They reshape reality. Before sanctions dominate headlines, Venezuela is already struggling. Its economy is fragile, overly dependent on oil exports, and vulnerable to price swings. But fragility is not destruction. Many countries live with weak institutions and survive. What changes Venezuela's trajectory is not one internal decision, but the moment when economic pressure becomes a coordinated strategy rather than a political signal. Oil is the core of that strategy. Venezuela's oil industry is not just a source of revenue, it is the backbone of the entire economy. It funds imports, stabilizes the currency, and supports public spending. When access to oil revenue is disrupted, everything else begins to fail. Sanctions target this point directly, even when they claim not to. When the United States escalates sanctions under Donald Trump, the pressure shifts from symbolic to systemic. Restrictions are no longer limited to individual officials. They expand to state institutions, financial channels, and the oil sector itself. The message is clear. Venezuela can no longer function as a normal participant in global trade. Banks stop processing payments. Insurance companies withdraw coverage. Shipping companies avoid Venezuelan ports. Oil buyers look elsewhere, not always because they are forced to, but because the risk becomes too high. Even transactions that remain technically legal become practically impossible. This is where the public narrative begins to diverge from reality. Official statements emphasize that humanitarian goods are exempt. Food and medicine are not sanctioned. In theory, this sounds reassuring. In practice, it ignores how modern economies actually work. Humanitarian goods do not move without financing, insurance, logistics, and currency exchange. When the financial system is frozen, exemptions exist only on paper. Shortages begin to spread, not because food does not exist, but because supply chains break. Hospitals lack equipment not because it is banned, but because payments cannot be processed and suppliers refuse to take the risk. The collapse appears internal, chaotic, and self-inflicted. That is precisely what makes the strategy effective. Donald Trump's role in this process is often misunderstood. He is not the inventor of sanctions, and he does not create the idea of economic pressure. What he does is remove ambiguity. He speaks openly about oil. He talks about leverage. He frames sanctions not as diplomacy, but as domination. This openness strips away the moral language and reveals the transactional logic underneath. Under Trump, sanctions become louder, faster, and more personal. Threats are issued publicly. Deadlines are announced on social media. Foreign companies are warned in advance. This style amplifies fear far beyond the legal text of the sanctions themselves. Markets react not to laws, but to signals, and Trump sends those signals constantly. The result is overcompliance. Companies withdraw even when rules allow limited engagement. Banks close accounts preemptively. Shipping routes disappear. The Venezuelan economy shrinks not only because of what is forbidden, but because of what becomes too dangerous to attempt. At the same time, the narrative hardens. Venezuela is increasingly described as a failed state. Its collapse is portrayed as inevitable, the natural outcome of bad ideology and poor leadership. Sanctions are presented as a moral stance, not an economic weapon. The suffering of the population is framed as tragic, but unavoidable, as if no one could have predicted these consequences. Yet the consequences are predictable. When oil revenues disappear, the state loses access to hard currency. Without currency, imports collapse. Without imports, inflation accelerates. Without stable prices, wages lose meaning, savings vanish, trust evaporates, people leave. This process is not gradual, it is cumulative. Each layer of pressure weakens the next. Each new restriction deepens dependence on emergency measures. Printing money becomes the only available option. Inflation turns into hyperinflation. The currency stops functioning as a store of value. Everyday transactions become acts of improvisation. Throughout this period, the language surrounding sanctions remains carefully constructed. Officials emphasize democracy, human rights, and accountability. Rarely do they discuss oil markets, financial clearing systems, or insurance networks. Rarely do they acknowledge that sanctions are not a side factor, but the central mechanism driving collapse. Trump's administration treats Venezuela as both a warning and an example. The message extends beyond Caracas. It is heard in boardrooms, ministries, and trading floors around the world. The lesson is simple. Resistance will be costly, prolonged, and visible. Compliance, on the other hand, promises reintegration and relief. This is where sanctions intersect with lies. Not lies in the sense of false statements, but lies of omission. The claim that sanctions target only governments, while sparing populations, ignores how economies function. The claim that collapse is purely internal ignores the scale and timing of external pressure. The claim that alternatives always exist ignores the structure of global finance. Venezuela attempts to adapt. It seeks alternative buyers, alternative currencies, alternative routes. Some deals succeed temporarily, but none restore stability. An economy operating under constant threat cannot plan, invest, or rebuild. Survival replaces development. Short-term solutions replace long-term strategy. As conditions worsen, international sympathy fades. Crises lose novelty. Images repeat. The world becomes accustomed to Venezuelan suffering. What once caused outrage becomes background noise. This normalization is not accidental. It reduces pressure to change policy and reinforces the idea that the situation is permanent. Inside Venezuela, the damage extends beyond economics. Institutions decay, skilled professionals leave, informal markets expand, trust in the future collapses. Even if sanctions were lifted tomorrow, recovery would take years. Not because infrastructure cannot be rebuilt, but because confidence cannot be restored instantly. Trump's approach accelerates this dynamic. By personalizing conflict and tying it explicitly to oil and power, he removes space for quiet adjustment. Everything becomes a test of dominance. Negotiation becomes weakness. Compromise becomes betrayal. The system locks itself into escalation. In the end, Venezuela is not destroyed by one decision or one leader. It is dismantled through sustained pressure applied at its most vulnerable point. Oil, once its strength, becomes its weakness. Sanctions, presented as ethical tools, function as instruments of economic warfare. And lies, carefully framed and repeated, ensure that responsibility appears diffuse rather than deliberate. This is not just a story about Venezuela. It is a demonstration of how modern power operates. Control over money matters more than control over resources. Access to systems matters more than sovereignty. And collapse does not need bombs when it can be engineered quietly, transaction by transaction. The tragedy is not only what happens to Venezuela, but how easily it is explained away. As long as sanctions are seen as consequences rather than causes, the pattern can repeat. Different country, different leader, same logic, same outcome. And that is the most uncomfortable truth in this story. What makes sanctions especially destructive is not their legal language, but their psychological effect. Once a country is labeled toxic, fear spreads faster than any formal restriction. Financial institutions do not wait for detailed instructions. They anticipate punishment. They withdraw preemptively. Risk departments shut down entire regions with a single decision. This invisible layer of enforcement multiplies the impact of every official measure. In Venezuela's case, this fear-driven compliance becomes decisive. Even when certain transactions remain technically allowed, they become practically unreachable. Banks refuse to touch them. Intermediaries disappear. Payments are delayed until they lose meaning. Contracts collapse not because they are illegal, but because no one is willing to be the last link in the chain. Oil, once again, sits at the center of this process. Producing oil is not enough. Selling it requires shipping, insurance, financing, refining, and clearing payments through international systems. When even one of these elements is disrupted, the entire operation slows down or stops. Sanctions exploit this interdependence with precision. They do not need to ban everything, they only need to create uncertainty. Under this pressure, Venezuela's oil output declines, not because oil runs out, but because the ecosystem that allows oil to move collapses. Equipment cannot be replaced, technology cannot be upgraded, skilled workers leave, maintenance is postponed, each delay compounds the next. What begins as a financial restriction turns into physical decay. At the same time, the international narrative simplifies the story. Declining oil production is blamed on mismanagement. Falling revenues are framed as proof of incompetence. Sanctions fade into the background, treated as a secondary factor. This selective focus allows policymakers to deny responsibility while maintaining pressure. Donald Trump's rhetoric reinforces this simplification. By speaking in absolutes, by framing Venezuela as a problem that must be crushed rather than managed, he removes nuance from the conversation. Complexity disappears. What remains is a binary moral frame: good versus bad, order versus chaos. In such a frame, collateral damage becomes acceptable. This framing also reshapes how allies behave. Countries that might otherwise seek mediation or gradual engagement choose distance instead. No one wants to be associated with a losing side. No one wants to test the limits of American enforcement. Isolation deepens not through coordination, but through imitation. Inside Venezuela, the effects are cumulative and deeply corrosive. As formal systems fail, informal ones expand. Barter replaces currency. Local networks replace national supply chains. Short-term survival strategies replace long-term planning. The economy fragments into disconnected pockets, each operating under its own rules. This fragmentation makes recovery even harder. Trust becomes the rarest commodity. People no longer trust prices, contracts, or institutions. Businesses stop investing. Families stop saving. The future becomes something abstract and distant. Emigration accelerates, draining the country of those most capable of rebuilding it. What remains is a society locked into crisis management mode. The lie at the heart of sanctions is the claim that suffering is accidental. That hardship is an unfortunate side effect rather than a predictable outcome. In reality, the entire mechanism relies on pressure spreading downward. Governments feel it first, but populations feel it most. Without widespread pain, sanctions fail. This is the part that is rarely acknowledged. Trump's administration does not hide this logic. It speaks openly about making conditions unbearable, about forcing change through exhaustion. This honesty is shocking, but it is also revealing. It exposes what had long been implicit. Sanctions are not about reform. They are about leverage. The longer the pressure lasts, the more permanent the damage becomes. Infrastructure decays. Education systems weaken. Healthcare systems collapse under strain. Even if restrictions were lifted, recovery would not begin from zero. It would begin from far below. Time lost under sanctions cannot be recovered. International institutions observe this process with detachment. Reports are written, concerns are expressed, aid is discussed, but the underlying architecture remains untouched. Sanctions stay in place. Financial barriers remain. The corridor does not open. What happens to Venezuela sends a signal far beyond its borders. Other resource-rich countries watch closely. They learn not from speeches, but from outcomes. The lesson is not about ideology. It is about alignment. Access to the system matters more than internal policy. Deviation carries a cost that few can afford. This is how modern power enforces itself. Quietly, incrementally, through rules that appear neutral but operate asymmetrically, through systems that punish some behaviors while rewarding others, through narratives that explain collapse as self-inflicted rather than engineered. Venezuela becomes a case study not only in economic failure but in narrative control. Who defines the cause defines the solution. As long as sanctions are framed as responses rather than drivers, responsibility remains blurred. Accountability disappears into abstraction. In the end, the destruction of Venezuela is not dramatic. It does not happen in a single moment. It unfolds through transactions that never happen, ships that never arrive, payments that never clear. It is slow, technical, and bureaucratic. That is what makes it so effective. Sanctions, oil, and lies form a closed triangle. Oil creates dependency. Sanctions exploit it. Lies obscure the mechanism. Together, they dismantle a country without the need for invasion or occupation. And once the process is complete, reversal becomes almost impossible. This is not a story about one administration or one president. Trump does not create the system. He reveals it. He accelerates it. He removes the mask. What remains is a structure that continues to operate long after the headlines fade. Venezuela is not destroyed because it refuses to change. It is destroyed because change is permitted only on terms dictated from outside. In such a system, sovereignty becomes conditional, and collapse becomes a tool. That is the real lesson hidden beneath the rhetoric. And it is not limited to Venezuela. Another critical layer of the story is how sanctions reshape incentives inside the country itself. When access to legal markets disappears, economic activity does not stop. It mutates. Power shifts away from transparent institutions toward informal networks that thrive on scarcity. Loyalty becomes more valuable than competence, and proximity to control matters more than efficiency. This environment rewards survival tactics rather than long-term planning. Over time, this distorts the entire economic culture, making recovery even more complex. The longer sanctions remain, the deeper these distortions become. What is destroyed is not only output, but institutional memory. The oil sector illustrates this perfectly. Oil production requires constant reinvestment, maintenance, and technological renewal. Under sanctions, these processes slow to a halt. Equipment ages, accidents become more frequent, and output declines further. Each reduction in production reinforces the narrative of failure, which is then used to justify continued pressure. This feedback loop ensures that decline appears self-generated. Even when oil prices rise globally, Venezuela cannot fully benefit. The system ensures that opportunity remains out of reach. Another rarely discussed effect is how sanctions redefine political choice. When economic survival depends on external approval, internal politics lose autonomy. Decisions are no longer judged by their domestic impact, but by how they will be perceived abroad. This narrows the political space and eliminates meaningful alternatives. Opposition and government alike operate within the same external constraints. The illusion of choice remains, but the range of outcomes is tightly controlled. In such conditions, political change does not guarantee economic relief. This fuels cynicism and deepens disengagement. Over time, international discourse hardens into certainty. Analysts speak with confidence about inevitability. Reports predict collapse as if it were a natural phenomenon. This certainty becomes self-fulfilling. Investors do not invest because collapse is expected. Institutions do not engage because recovery is doubted. The future is discounted before it arrives. Once expectations solidify, reversing them requires far more than policy change. It requires a fundamental shift in perception. The final consequence is normalization. A prolonged crisis stops being shocking and becomes routine. Headlines lose urgency and global attention moves on. What remains is a country frozen in dysfunction, maintained just enough to survive but never enough to recover. This outcome is not accidental. It is the stable equilibrium of sustained pressure. Venezuela does not need to be rebuilt or destroyed, only managed at a low level. And that ultimately is what makes sanctions such a powerful tool.